Politician's career collapsed. After lying in court, Judge Caprio's unforgettable takedown, the first frost of November, had painted delicate patterns across the windows of the Providence Municipal Court, creating an almost ethereal backdrop for what would become one of the most consequential days in Judge Frank Caprio's distinguished career. The morning light filtered through these crystalline designs, casting dancing shadows across the familiar courtroom where justice had been served. With compassion for over 3 decades, but today would be different. Today, the very foundations of truth and integrity would be tested in ways that even Judge Caprio's vast experience had not fully prepared him for. At precisely 7:15 in the morning, as was his unwavering custom, Judge Caprio arrived at the courthouse. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his black judicial robe pressed to perfection, and his warm brown eyes carried their characteristic blend of wisdom and kindness. At 79 years old, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who understood that every step he took through these halls carried the weight of public trust and the hopes of those seeking justice. The case that would define this particular day had been months in the making, winding its way through the complex machinery of Rhode Island's legal system, like a slow-burning fuse approaching dynamite. What had begun as a routine traffic enforcement matter had evolved into something far more significant, a test of whether political power could shield someone from the consequences of their actions, even in Judge Caprio's courtroom where wealth and influence had never been currencies that could purchase preferential treatment. As Judge Caprio settled into his chambers, surrounded by the law books that had been his constant companions through decades of service, he opened the file that would soon make headlines across the nation. The defendant was Marcus Wellington III, a name that carried considerable weight in Rhode Island political circles. At 47 years old, Wellington served as the state's Deputy Attorney General, a position he had parlayed into considerable influence and, according to his critics, considerable arrogance. Wellington's political rise had been meteoric, built on a foundation of Ivy League credentials, family connections that stretch back to the founding fathers of Rhode Island, and a carefully cultivated public image as a crusader against government corruption. The irony was not lost on those who had been following his career closely. Here was a man who had built his reputation on fighting the very type of behavior he now stood accused of. The case itself seemed almost mundane on its surface. Wellington had been cited for running a red light at the intersection of Westminster and Union Streets on a busy Thursday afternoon in September. The violation had been captured by one of the city's automated traffic cameras, the kind of technology that had made traffic enforcement more efficient, but also more impersonal. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a simple matter. Pay the fine, perhaps attend traffic school, and move on with life. But Marcus Wellington was not a normal citizen, and his response to this citation had been anything but routine. Instead of simply paying the fine like countless others before him, Wellington had chosen to contest the citation, claiming that he had not been driving the vehicle at the time of the violation. This defense, while not unheard of, required sworn testimony and opened the door to a level of scrutiny that most people preferred to avoid. Judge Caprio reviewed the preliminary evidence with the same meticulous attention he brought to every case, regardless of the defendant's status or background. The traffic camera footage was clear and unambiguous. A silver BMW sedan with license plates registered to Marcus Wellington had clearly entered the intersection after the traffic light had turned red. The timestamp showed 3:47 p.m. on September 12th, and the image quality was sharp enough to make out significant details about both the vehicle and its occupant. What made this case particularly intriguing was Wellington's categorical denial that he had been driving the vehicle. In his initial response to the citation, filed through one of Rhode Island's most prestigious law firms, Wellington had claimed that his car had been borrowed by a friend on the day in question. This friend, according to Wellington's story, was someone from out of state who had since returned home and was unavailable for testimony. Judge Caprio had seen many creative defenses over the years, some legitimate and others clearly fabricated. His experience had taught him to look beyond the surface of any claim, to examine not just the legal merits, but the human motivations behind each story. Something about Wellington's defense struck him as suspicious, though he remained committed to giving every defendant the benefit of the doubt until evidence proved otherwise. The morning preparation also included reviewing Wellington's background, which read like a textbook example of political ambition realized. Born into one of Rhode Island's most prominent families, Wellington had attended Phillips Exeter Academy, graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, and earned his law degree from Yale. His entry into politics had been swift and successful, moving from a junior prosecutor position to Deputy Attorney General in just 8 years. Wellington's public persona was carefully crafted and religiously maintained. He appeared regularly at charity events, spoke passionately about government accountability, and had been instrumental in prosecuting several high-profile corruption cases that had earned him considerable media attention and public acclaim. His office walls were lined with awards, commendations, and photographs, showing him alongside governors, senators, and even a president. But Judge Caprio had learned to look beyond public facades, having seen too many cases where outward respectability masked inner corruption. The preliminary investigation conducted by the court clerk had uncovered some interesting details about September 12th, the day Wellington claimed not to have been driving his vehicle. Phone records, while not yet officially part of the evidence, suggested that Wellington had been in Providence that afternoon, making calls from his office and attending meetings according to his official calendar. As Judge Caprio prepared for what he expected to be a straightforward hearing, he could not have anticipated that this case would become a defining moment, not just in his own career, but in the broader conversation about political accountability and the equal application of justice. The morning sun climbed higher over Providence, burning away the frost on the courthouse windows and illuminating a day that would be remembered long after the gavel fell for the final time. The courtroom began to fill earlier than usual. Word having somehow leaked that the Deputy Attorney General would be appearing before Judge Caprio. The press section, normally empty for routine traffic cases, had attracted reporters from several local news outlets and even a correspondent from a national political website. The gallery filled with a mixture of courthouse regulars, political observers, and curious citizens who had heard whispers about the case. Marcus Wellington arrived at the courthouse at exactly 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before proceedings were scheduled to begin. He stepped out of a black town car, his appearance immaculate as always. His navy blue suit was perfectly tailored, his silk tie knotted with precision, and his silver hair styled in the way that had become his trademark. Everything about his demeanor suggested supreme confidence, the bearing of a man who had never doubted his ability to control any situation he encountered. Wellington was accompanied by his attorney, Richard Cromwell, senior partner at Cromwell, Hastings and Associates, the law firm that represented most of Rhode Island's political elite. Cromwell's reputation was built on making problems disappear for powerful clients, and his presence suggested that Wellington was taking this matter seriously, despite its apparent simplicity. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Wellington paused to speak with the gathered reporters, displaying the media savvy that had served him well throughout his political career. His statement was brief but carefully crafted. He expressed confidence in the justice system, respect for Judge Caprio's reputation for fairness, and certainty that the truth would prevail. He portrayed himself as a victim of mistaken identity, suggesting that even public officials could fall prey to bureaucratic errors. The confidence in Wellington's voice was matched by the certainty in his eyes. This was a man who had never lost a case that mattered, never encountered a problem that money, influence, or political connections couldn't solve. He had built his career on the assumption that rules were for other people, that his position and connections provided a level of protection that ordinary citizens could never enjoy. But as Wellington entered Judge Caprio's courtroom, he was stepping into a domain where different rules applied, where justice was administered by a man who had spent decades proving that wealth, power, and political influence meant nothing when weighed against truth and human dignity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the facts of a simple traffic violation, but the very principles upon which American justice was supposed to be founded. Judge Caprio took his place behind the bench at precisely 9 a.m., his presence immediately commanding the respect and attention of everyone in the courtroom. As he looked out over the assembled crowd, his eyes briefly met those of Marcus Wellington, and in that moment, both men perhaps sensed that this would be no ordinary hearing. The morning light continued to stream through the courthouse windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become legendary in the annals of judicial history. The moment Judge Caprio called the court to order, the atmosphere in the packed courtroom shifted perceptibly. The usual casual murmur of routine traffic court proceedings was replaced by a tense attention that seemed to electrify the air. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised over notepads, while political observers watched with the intensity of spectators at a championship boxing match. This was no longer just about a traffic violation. This was about whether political power could trump truth in one of America's most respected courtrooms. Marcus Wellington approached the defendant's table with the confident stride of a man who had never doubted his ability to control any narrative. His attorney, Richard Cromwell, followed closely behind, his expensive briefcase undoubtedly containing what they believed would be sufficient legal firepower to dismiss this inconvenient matter quickly and quietly. Wellington's demeanor suggested supreme confidence, the bearing of someone who viewed this proceeding as little more than a minor inconvenience to be swept aside with the proper application of legal expertise and political influence. Judge Caprio observed this confident approach with the same gentle attention he brought to every defendant who appeared before him, regardless of their station in life. His 3 decades on the bench had taught him that truth had a way of revealing itself, often in the smallest details and most unexpected moments. The preliminary review of this case had raised questions in his mind, subtle inconsistencies that his experienced eye had detected even in the limited documentation available. The case was called with the usual formality: the State of Rhode Island versus Marcus Wellington III, citation number 2024 TR 8847, failure to stop at a red light signal. Wellington rose and approached the bench, his posture erect, his expression conveying the mix of respectful deference and subtle superiority that had served him well in political circles. Cromwell remained at the table, confident that his client's testimony would be sufficient to resolve this matter. Judge Caprio's voice carried its characteristic warmth as he addressed the defendant. "Mr. Wellington, you stand accused of running a red light at the intersection of Westminster and Union Streets on September 12th at approximately 3:47 p.m. The citation indicates this violation was captured by automated traffic enforcement. How do you plead to this charge?" Wellington's response was delivered with the practiced confidence of a career politician addressing a friendly audience. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I was not operating the vehicle at the time of the alleged violation. My car was being used by a friend from out of state, and I have documentation to support this claim." The words were spoken with such certainty that they might have convinced a less experienced judge or a more politically minded court. But Judge Caprio had spent decades learning to read the subtleties of human behavior, the micro-expressions and vocal inflections that often revealed more than words themselves. Something about Wellington's delivery struck him as rehearsed, too polished for someone simply stating a straightforward fact. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Caprio continued, his tone remaining gentle but probing, "can you tell the court who was driving your vehicle on that date?" Wellington's answer came without hesitation, as if he had anticipated this exact question. "A longtime friend named David Harrison, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison was visiting from Connecticut and needed to borrow my car for a business meeting in downtown Providence. Unfortunately, he has since returned to Connecticut and is unavailable to testify due to his own business commitments." Judge Caprio made a note on his legal pad, his expression thoughtful. "And do you have any documentation of this arrangement, Mr. Wellington? Perhaps communication with Mr. Harrison about borrowing your vehicle?" "Unfortunately, Your Honor, this was an informal arrangement between friends. Mr. Harrison called me that morning asking to borrow the car, and I agreed. There was no written agreement or formal documentation because I had no reason to anticipate that such documentation would be necessary. The explanation was plausible enough on its surface, the kind of informal arrangement that certainly occurred between friends. But Judge Caprio's experience had taught him to examine not just the plausibility of a story, but its consistency with other established facts. He turned his attention to the prosecution's evidence, beginning with the traffic camera footage that had initiated this entire proceeding. "The court will now review the automated traffic enforcement evidence," Judge Caprio announced, as the courtroom's video system displayed the crystal-clear footage from the intersection camera. The large monitor showed a silver BMW sedan approaching the intersection as the traffic light cycled from yellow to red. The vehicle clearly entered the intersection after the signal had changed, constituting a clear violation of Rhode Island traffic law. What made the footage particularly compelling was not just the clear capture of the violation, but the quality of the image, showing the vehicle's interior. The camera angle and lighting conditions had combined to provide an unusually clear view through the windshield, clearly showing a single occupant in the driver's seat. While facial features were not distinct enough for positive identification, the general build, posture, and even the clothing of the driver were clearly visible. Judge Caprio studied the footage carefully, running it several times to examine different aspects of the scene. "Mr. Wellington, looking at this footage, can you confirm that this is indeed your vehicle?" Wellington examined the monitor, his confidence unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. That appears to be my BMW. But as I've testified, I was not the person driving it at the time of this violation. Can you describe your friend Mr. Harrison's physical appearance?" Judge Caprio asked, his tone still gentle but increasingly focused. Wellington's description came readily. "David is approximately 6 feet tall, medium build, brown hair. He was wearing a dark business suit that day, as he was attending a professional meeting." The description was generic enough to match countless individuals, but Judge Caprio found himself comparing it to what was visible in the traffic camera footage. The figure behind the wheel certainly matched Wellington's general description of his friend, but something about the posture and positioning suggested familiarity with the vehicle that went beyond someone borrowing it for a single day. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Caprio continued, "you mentioned that Mr. Harrison contacted you that morning to borrow your vehicle. Can you recall what time this conversation took place?" "It was fairly early, Your Honor, probably around 8:30 or 9 a.m. David called to ask if he could borrow the car for his afternoon meeting." Judge Caprio made another note, then consulted a document that had been provided by the prosecution. "The court has received your official calendar for September 12th, Mr. Wellington, which was provided by your office in response to a routine records request. According to this calendar, You had a staff meeting scheduled from 9 hours to 10:30 a.m., followed by a conference call with federal prosecutors from 11 hours a.m. to noon, and then a lunch meeting with the governor's chief of staff from 12:30 to 2 p.m. Does this accurately reflect your schedule for that day? Wellington nodded confidently. Yes, Your Honor, that sounds correct. I had a busy day of official business. And after your lunch meeting with the governor's chief of staff, what were your activities for the remainder of the afternoon? Here, Wellington paused for just a moment, barely perceptible, but long enough for Judge Caprio's experienced eye to notice. I returned to my office to catch up on correspondence and prepare for the next day's activities, Your Honor. Judge Caprio consulted another document, this one showing cell phone tower data that had been subpoenaed as part of the routine investigation. In Rhode Island's system, even traffic violations could trigger broader investigations when inconsistencies arose, and Wellington's categorical denial had prompted a more thorough examination of the evidence. Mr. Wellington, the court has also received cell phone location data for your device on September 12th. This data shows your phone connecting to towers in the downtown Providence area throughout the afternoon, including at 3:47 p.m., the exact time of the traffic violation. Can you explain how your phone was in downtown Providence if you were in your office and your car was being driven by Mr. Harrison? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over Wellington's carefully constructed narrative. For the first time since taking the stand, his supreme confidence showed the slightest crack. His eyes darted briefly to his attorney, who remained seated, but whose expression had shifted from relaxed confidence to alert concern. Wellington's response came more slowly this time, his earlier fluency replaced by careful consideration. Your Honor, my office is located in downtown Providence, so it would be natural for my phone to connect to those towers while I was working. But Mr. Wellington, Judge Caprio continued, his voice still gentle but now carrying unmistakable authority, the specific tower your phone connected to at 3:47 p.m. serves the area around Westminster and Union Streets, several blocks from your office building. Can you explain why your phone would connect to that particular tower? The silence that followed this question seemed to expand and fill the entire courtroom. Reporters stopped writing, spectators stopped shifting in their seats, and even the usual background sounds of the courthouse seemed to fade away. Wellington stood frozen at the defendant's table, his mind clearly racing to find an explanation that could reconcile his testimony with the mounting evidence. Judge Caprio waited patiently, his expression compassionate but unwavering. In his decades of service, he had given countless defendants the opportunity to correct their statements, to acknowledge mistakes, to choose truth over deception. This moment, this pause, was Wellington's opportunity to step back from the precipice he was approaching. Your Honor, Wellington finally said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. I may have left my office briefly that afternoon for a walk or to get coffee. I don't recall the exact details, but it's possible I was in that area around that time. The admission was small, but it represented the first crack in Wellington's story. Judge Caprio recognized the significance of this moment, the point where a defendant's narrative began to shift from categorical denial toward something approaching acknowledgement of the truth. But this was only the beginning of what would prove to be a complete unraveling of one of the most elaborate deceptions ever attempted in his courtroom. The morning sun had climbed higher in the Providence sky, its light now streaming directly through the courthouse windows and illuminating the scene of what was rapidly becoming a legendary confrontation between truth and power. The stage was set for revelations that would shock not just the courtroom, but the entire political establishment of Rhode Island. The partial admission that Wellington might have been in the area of the traffic violation at the precise time it occurred created a palpable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Judge Caprio observed this moment with the same patient attention. He had brought to thousands of cases over his career, understanding that truth often emerged not in dramatic revelations, but in small acknowledgments that opened doors to larger understandings. Wellington's slight modification of his story represented exactly such a moment, a crack in a carefully constructed facade through which light was beginning to penetrate. Wellington's attorney, Richard Cromwell, recognized the danger of his client's evolving testimony and rose from his seat with the practiced urgency of a lawyer, watching his case slip away. Your Honor, if I may, my client is doing his best to recall events from over 2 months ago. The slight uncertainty about his exact location during a brief afternoon walk doesn't contradict his core testimony that he was not driving his vehicle when this violation occurred. Judge Caprio acknowledged the attorney's concern with a gentle nod, but his focus remained on the mounting inconsistencies in Wellington's account. Mr. Cromwell, your client's ability to recall details will certainly be taken into consideration. However, the court must examine all available evidence to determine the truth of this matter. The judge then turned his attention back to Wellington, his warm brown eyes carrying the weight of 3 decades spent distinguishing between honest mistakes and deliberate deception. Mr. Wellington, let's return to your friend David Harrison. You mentioned that he needed to borrow your car for a business meeting in downtown Providence. Can you tell the court more about this meeting? What type of business was Mr. Harrison conducting? Wellington's response came more slowly now, his earlier fluency replaced by visible calculation. David works in consulting, Your Honor. He was meeting with potential clients about expanding their operations into Connecticut. I don't have specific details about his business, as our friendship is more personal than professional. Judge Caprio made careful notes as Wellington spoke, but his attention was equally focused on the defendant's body language and vocal patterns. Years of experience had taught him that people under stress often revealed their deception through subtle changes in their demeanor, shifts in posture, alterations in speech patterns, and unconscious gestures that contradicted their verbal statements. And where specifically was Mr. Harrison supposed to meet these potential clients? Judge Caprio continued. Wellington hesitated for a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than its actual duration. I believe it was somewhere in the downtown area, Your Honor. David mentioned it was convenient to several restaurants where they planned to continue their discussions over lunch. The vagueness of Wellington's answers stood in stark contrast to his earlier specificity about times and arrangements. Judge Caprio recognized this pattern. As deceptions became more complex, details became more general, and confident assertions gave way to qualified statements and uncertain recollections. Mr. Wellington, did Mr. Harrison return your vehicle to you personally, or did he leave it somewhere for you to retrieve? He returned it to my home that evening, Your Honor. We had a brief conversation about his meeting, and then he left to return to Connecticut. Judge Caprio consulted another document that had been provided by the prosecution's investigation. The court has received information from your building's security system, Mr. Wellington. Your downtown office building requires keycard access, and these records show your card being used to enter the building at 8:15 a.m. on September 12th and to exit at 3:35 p.m. There are no other entries or exits recorded for your card that day. Can you explain how you left your office for a walk, as you mentioned earlier, without using your keycard to exit the building? The question struck Wellington like a physical blow. His face paled slightly, and for the first time since the hearing began, his supreme confidence appeared to crack completely. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of implications that everyone in the courtroom could feel, but that Wellington seemed unable to address. Cromwell rose again, this time with obvious urgency. Your Honor, building, security systems are not infallible. It's possible that my client exited through a different door, or that there was a technical malfunction with the keycard system. Judge Caprio acknowledged the attorney's point, but pressed forward with his inquiry. Mr. Wellington, the building's security office has provided a statement indicating that all exits from your floor require keycard access and that their system was functioning normally on September 12th. They also noted that the emergency exits are equipped with alarms that would have sounded if opened. Are you suggesting that you triggered a building alarm to take a brief walk? Wellington's composure was now visibly shaken. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the cool November morning, and his hands showed a slight tremor as he gripped the defendant's table. Your Honor, I may have been mistaken about leaving the building. The pressures of my position sometimes make it difficult to recall every detail of every day with perfect clarity. Mr. Wellington, Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying gentle but unmistakable authority. You are under oath in this courtroom. The statements you make here carry the full weight of perjury laws. I want to give you an opportunity to reconsider your testimony in light of the evidence we've reviewed. The offer was classic Judge Caprio, firm in his commitment to truth, but compassionate in his recognition that people sometimes found themselves in situations where acknowledging mistakes required considerable courage. Throughout his career, he had given countless defendants the opportunity to correct false statements, understanding that the path to justice often required offering people a way to step back from the precipice of serious legal jeopardy. But Wellington's response revealed the depth of his commitment to his false narrative, and perhaps his inability to comprehend the gravity of his situation. Your Honor, I stand by my testimony. I was not driving my vehicle when this violation occurred. If there are technical discrepancies in various record-keeping systems, that doesn't change the fundamental truth of my statement. Judge Caprio felt a familiar sadness settle over him, the disappointment he experienced whenever he encountered someone who chose to compound their problems with persistent dishonesty. In his decades of service, he had learned that some defendants would continue lying even when the truth would serve them better, driven by pride, fear, or a fundamental inability to accept responsibility for their actions. Very well, Mr. Wellington. The court will now hear additional evidence. Judge Caprio signaled to the bailiff, who approached the bench with a manila envelope that had been delivered just that morning. The court has received enhanced analysis of the traffic camera footage performed by the Rhode Island State Police Forensic Imaging Unit. The enhanced footage appeared on the courtroom monitor, and the improvement in clarity was immediately apparent. Computer enhancement had sharpened the image quality and increased the contrast, making details that had been barely visible in the original footage now clearly discernible. Most significantly, the driver's face was now clearly visible through the windshield. A collective gasp arose from the gallery as the enhanced image revealed unmistakable features that matched the man standing at the defendant's table. The driver in the BMW was clearly Marcus Wellington. The same silver hair, the same facial structure, even the same navy blue suit he was wearing in court that day. Wellington stared at the monitor in apparent shock, his face draining of color, as he confronted irrefutable visual evidence of his presence behind the wheel of his vehicle. The enhanced footage ran several times, each repetition making the identification more certain and the magnitude of his deception more apparent. Mr. Wellington, Judge Caprio said quietly, do you recognize the person driving your vehicle in this enhanced footage? The question hung in the air like a final challenge, a last opportunity for Wellington to acknowledge the truth before the full weight of his deception came crashing down upon him. The courtroom waited in absolute silence. Reporters with pens poised, spectators holding their breath, and Judge Caprio maintaining his characteristic composure while dealing with one of the most brazen attempts at deception he had encountered. In his long career, Wellington's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The man who had built his career on eloquent arguments and persuasive presentations found himself speechless in the face of undeniable evidence. His carefully constructed narrative had completely collapsed, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way that his political experience had never prepared him for. "Your Honor," Cromwell interjected desperately, "the enhanced imaging process can sometimes create artifacts or distortions that might make identification uncertain. We would request an independent analysis of this footage before." Judge Caprio raised his hand gently, stopping the attorney's objection. "Mr. Cromwell, the enhancement was performed by certified forensic experts using standard law enforcement protocols. The chain of custody has been properly maintained, and the original footage remains unchanged. The enhancement merely reveals details that were present but not clearly visible in the original recording." The judge then focused his attention back on Wellington, his expression combining disappointment with the patient firmness that had characterized his approach to justice throughout his career. "Mr. Wellington, you have been given multiple opportunities to correct your testimony. The evidence clearly shows that you were driving your vehicle when this violation occurred. More significantly, you have provided false testimony under oath regarding these facts. Do you wish to revise your statements?" To this court, the moment had arrived when Wellington could no longer maintain his deception, when the weight of evidence had become so overwhelming that even his political training in deflection and misdirection could not save him. The enhanced footage had stripped away his last defense, leaving him naked before the truth he had tried so desperately to avoid. The courtroom waited in tense silence as Wellington grappled with the complete collapse of his carefully constructed lies, knowing that his next words would determine not just the outcome of this traffic case, but the future of his political career and his personal integrity. The stage was set for a moment of reckoning that would reverberate far beyond the walls of Judge Caprio's courtroom. The silence that followed Judge Caprio's final question seemed to expand infinitely, filling every corner of the packed courtroom with a tension so palpable it felt almost solid. Marcus Wellington stood frozen at the defendant's table, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: shock, fear, desperation, and perhaps for the first time in his adult life, genuine uncertainty about his ability to control the outcome of a situation through political maneuvering or legal technicalities. Judge Caprio remained patient, his hands folded before him in the gesture that courthouse veterans recognized as his deepest contemplative mode. Throughout his distinguished career, he had encountered many defendants who had lied under oath, but rarely had he witnessed such an elaborate and persistent deception from someone whose professional responsibilities included upholding the very laws they were violating. The irony was profound and troubling. A deputy attorney general, sworn to seek justice and uphold truth, standing in his courtroom having committed perjury in an attempt to avoid responsibility for a simple traffic violation. Wellington's breathing had become visibly labored, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. The man who had spent years prosecuting others for various forms of dishonesty now found himself trapped by his own deceptions, caught in a web of lies that had grown more complex with each false statement he had made under oath. "Your Honor," Wellington finally whispered, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom, I need a moment to consult with my attorney." Judge Caprio nodded with characteristic compassion. "Of course, Mr. Wellington. The court will recess for 15 minutes to allow you to confer with counsel." As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in a buzz of whispered conversations. Reporters furiously scribbled notes and made hushed phone calls to their editors, recognizing that they were witnessing what would likely become a major political scandal. Spectators leaned forward to catch glimpses of Wellington and his attorney as they huddled in intense conversation at the defendant's table. Cromwell's animated gestures and Wellington's increasingly pale complexion told the story of a consultation that was not going well. The attorney was clearly explaining the gravity of the situation, that his client had not only committed perjury in open court, but had done so in front of a room full of witnesses, including multiple reporters. The political implications were staggering, but the legal consequences were even more immediate and serious. During the recess, word of the dramatic proceedings had somehow leaked beyond the courthouse walls. Wellington's staff at the Attorney General's office were fielding increasingly urgent calls from political reporters, lobbyists, and fellow politicians seeking to understand the scope of the crisis that was unfolding. The governor's office had reportedly called an emergency meeting to discuss potential political fallout, and rumors were already circulating about Wellington's future in state government. When Judge Caprio returned to the bench, the atmosphere in the courtroom had intensified. Even further, additional reporters had somehow gained entry, and the gallery was now completely packed with observers who sensed they were witnessing a historic moment. Wellington appeared even more shaken than before, his earlier confidence completely evaporated and replaced by the hollow expression of a man confronting the complete destruction of everything he had worked to build. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying its characteristic gentleness despite the gravity of the situation, "have you had sufficient time to consult with your attorney?" Wellington nodded slowly, unable to meet the judge's eyes directly. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the political authority and confidence that had characterized his public appearances for over a decade. "Yes, Your Honor. Do you wish to make any revisions to your previous testimony?" The question represented Wellington's final opportunity to choose truth over continued deception, to accept responsibility for his actions rather than compounding his problems with additional lies. Judge Caprio's expression conveyed both sternness and compassion, the look of a father disappointed in his child's choices, but still hoping for redemption. Wellington stood silently for nearly a full minute, his internal struggle visible to everyone. In the courtroom, his political instincts warred with whatever remained of his conscience, his survival mechanism battling against his professional oath to uphold justice and truth. The man who had built his career on prosecuting others for dishonesty now faced the moment of choosing between continued lies and career-destroying honesty. "Your Honor," Wellington finally said, his voice breaking slightly, "I was driving my vehicle when the violation occurred. There is no David Harrison. I fabricated that story to avoid responsibility for running the red light." The admission hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps arose from the gallery, reporters frantically scribbled notes, and even the court officers exchanged glances of surprise at the magnitude of the confession. Wellington had not only admitted to the traffic violation, but had acknowledged committing perjury, a felony that would end his political career and likely result in criminal prosecution. Judge Caprio received the confession with the same patient dignity he brought to all proceedings, but those who knew him well could see the deep sadness in his eyes. This was not a moment of triumph, but of profound disappointment in human nature and the corrupting influence of power and pride. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Caprio said quietly, "thank you for finally telling the truth. However, your admission raises serious concerns beyond the original traffic violation. You have provided false testimony under oath in this courtroom, which constitutes perjury under Rhode Island law." The weight of this statement settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed a political career self-destruct in real time, that a man who had held one of the highest law enforcement positions in the state had admitted to committing a felony in open court. Wellington nodded numbly, finally understanding the full scope of what his deception had cost him. "I understand, Your Honor. I accept full responsibility for my actions." Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he contemplated the appropriate response to this unprecedented situation. In his 3 decades on the bench, he had always believed in the possibility of redemption, in the power of accountability to transform people and situations. But this case presented unique challenges. The defendant was a high-ranking public official who had violated the public trust in the most fundamental way possible. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Caprio continued, "in my 33 years on this bench, I have seen many people make mistakes. I have seen good people make bad choices, and I have seen the power of accountability to transform lives and restore integrity. But I have rarely encountered someone in your position, a law enforcement official sworn to uphold justice, who has so deliberately violated the principles they are meant to protect." The judge's voice carried the weight of decades spent balancing justice with mercy. But this case tested those principles in ways that few others had. You didn't just run a red light, Mr. Wellington. You didn't just lie to a police officer. You came into this courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then proceeded to construct an elaborate fiction designed to avoid responsibility for your actions. Judge Caprio paused, allowing the full weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. You created a fictional friend, invented a business meeting, and maintained this deception even when presented with mounting evidence of its falsity. You did all of this while holding a position of public trust, while drawing a salary paid by the taxpayers of Rhode Island, while representing yourself as a champion of justice and accountability. Wellington stood with his head bowed, finally comprehending the magnitude of his fall from grace. The man who had prosecuted others for far lesser offenses now faced the complete destruction of his career and reputation over what had begun as a simple traffic violation that could have been resolved with a modest fine. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Caprio continued, his voice taking on the tone of a disappointed father addressing a wayward son, "I want you to understand something that perhaps your position of privilege has allowed you to forget. Justice is not negotiable. Truth is not optional. The law applies equally to everyone who enters this courtroom, regardless of their title, their connections, or their political ambitions." The judge then did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He stood up from the bench and walked around to stand directly in front of Wellington, removing the physical barrier that typically separated the judge from the defendant. The gesture was unprecedented in Judge Caprio's long career, but this moment called for something beyond traditional judicial protocol. "Mr. Wellington," he said quietly, speaking directly to the man rather than delivering judgment from on high, "I have spent my entire adult life believing in the possibility of redemption, in the power of truth to heal and transform. But redemption requires genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing, acceptance of consequences, and a commitment to becoming better than we were." Judge Caprio's voice carried both sternness and compassion as he continued, "You have finally told the truth, but only when continued lying became impossible. You have accepted responsibility, but only after exhausting every possible avenue of deception. This raises serious questions about whether your acknowledgement represents genuine remorse or simply calculated damage control." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Wellington struggled to find words adequate to the moment. His political training had prepared him for many challenges, but nothing in his experience had equipped him for this kind of moral reckoning, delivered with such gentle but devastating effectiveness. "Your Honor," Wellington finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have no excuse for my behavior. I allowed my pride and my fear of embarrassment to override my commitment to truth and justice. I have dishonored my office, violated the public trust, and failed to live up to the principles I have sworn to uphold. Judge Caprio studied Wellington's face carefully, his decades of experience in reading people coming to bear on this crucial moment. Mr. Wellington, the question now is not just what consequences you will face for your actions, but whether you truly understand the damage you have done, not just to yourself, but to the institution of justice and to the public's faith in their elected officials. The judge returned to the bench, his expression grave as he prepared to render judgment. For the original traffic violation, running a red light, I sentence you to pay the maximum fine of $500 and attend a defensive driving course within 60 days. The courtroom waited expectantly, understanding that the traffic violation was merely the beginning of Wellington's legal troubles. However, Judge Caprio continued, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, the matter of perjury committed in this courtroom requires immediate action. I am referring this case to the Rhode Island Attorney General's Office for Criminal Prosecution. Additionally, I am notifying the Rhode Island Supreme Court's Committee on Character and Fitness regarding your conduct, as it bears directly on your fitness to practice law in this state. The implications of these actions were staggering. Criminal prosecution for perjury could result in imprisonment and would certainly end Wellington's political career. The referral to the Character and Fitness Committee could result in the suspension or revocation of his law license, destroying his professional prospects even beyond politics. Furthermore, Judge Caprio added, I am ordering a complete transcript of these proceedings to be provided to the Governor's Office, the leadership of the General Assembly, and the Rhode Island Ethics Commission. The people of Rhode Island deserve to know the full extent of what has occurred in this courtroom today. Wellington's knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the defendant's table for support. The man who had entered the courtroom that morning, expecting to dismiss a simple traffic citation, now faced the complete destruction of his career, his reputation, and his future prospects. Judge Caprio's expression softened slightly as he prepared to deliver his final remarks. Mr. Wellington, I want you to understand that these consequences are not born of vindictiveness or political motivation. They are the natural result of your choices. Choices to lie, to deceive, to abuse the public trust, and to mock the very system of justice you were sworn to protect. The judge's voice took on the warm, paternal tone that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island and beyond. But I also want you to know that even now, even after everything that has happened, I believe in the possibility of redemption. The consequences you face are severe, but they are not the end of your story. How you respond to these consequences, how you rebuild your life from this point forward, will determine who you truly are. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his eyes meeting Wellington's directly. You have lost your position, your reputation, and likely your career, but you still have the opportunity to regain your integrity. You can choose to learn from this experience, to dedicate yourself to making amends for the damage you have caused, and to become the kind of person who would never again choose deception over truth. The judge then addressed the broader courtroom, his voice carrying the passion that had made him a national symbol of judicial integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed here today is both tragic and instructive. It is tragic because we have seen how pride and deception can destroy a life and career. It is instructive because it reminds us that no one is above the law, that truth will always emerge, and that justice applies equally to everyone, regardless of their position or power. Judge Caprio's gaze swept across the faces in the gallery, making eye contact with reporters, spectators, and court officials. This case will undoubtedly generate significant public attention, and rightfully so. The people of Rhode Island trusted Mr. Wellington with significant authority and responsibility, and he has violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible. but I hope that this case will also serve as a reminder of the importance of truth, integrity, and accountability in public service. As the judge prepared to conclude the proceedings, Wellington raised his hand slightly, his voice shaking as he requested permission to speak. "Your Honor," Wellington said, his voice barely audible. "May I address the court one final time?" Judge Caprio nodded, his expression compassionate despite the gravity of the situation. "Of course, Mr. Wellington." Wellington straightened his shoulders slightly, summoning whatever dignity remained to him. "Your Honor, I want to publicly apologize to the people of Rhode Island, to my colleagues in law enforcement, and to this court for my actions. I have violated every principle I claim to represent, and I have dishonored the trust placed in me." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I cannot undo the damage I have caused, but I can commit to facing the consequences of my actions. With honesty and humility, I hereby tender my resignation from the position of Deputy Attorney General, effective immediately, and I will cooperate fully with any investigations or proceedings that result from my conduct." The resignation announcement sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. While everyone had understood that Wellington's career was effectively over, his formal resignation in open court added a sense of finality to the proceedings that was both dramatic and appropriate. Judge Caprio received the resignation announcement with a slight nod. "Mr. Wellington, your resignation is noted by the court, though such decisions are ultimately between you and your superiors in state government." The judge then delivered his final statement, one that would be quoted in newspapers and legal journals for years to come. Let the record show that in the case of the state of Rhode Island versus Marcus Wellington III, the defendant has been found guilty of the traffic violation and has admitted to committing perjury in open court. But let the record also show that, in the end, truth prevailed, justice was served, and the principle that no one is above the law was upheld. Judge Caprio's voice carried a note of sadness as he concluded. "Mr. Wellington, I hope that someday, perhaps years from now, you will look back on this day not as the day your career ended, but as the day you began to rebuild your character and integrity. That choice is now yours to make." As the gavel fell, for the final time, the sound echoed through the courtroom with unusual resonance. The spectators sat in thoughtful silence, processing what they had witnessed. Not just the destruction of a political career, but a masterclass in how justice should be administered with both firmness and compassion. Wellington gathered his papers with shaking hands, his transformation from confident politician to humble defendant complete. As he walked slowly toward the courtroom exit, reporters preparing their stories and observers contemplating the lessons of the day, Judge Caprio remained at the bench, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of a man who had just administered justice in one of the most significant cases of his career. The afternoon sun was setting over Providence, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows and bringing to a close a day that would be remembered as a defining moment in Rhode Island's political and judicial history. The price of truth had been paid, justice had been served, and the integrity of the judicial system had been upheld by a judge whose gentle wisdom and unwavering principles had once again proven that in his courtroom, truth and justice would always prevail over power and deception. The aftermath of Marcus Wellington's spectacular downfall in Judge Caprio's courtroom reverberated through Rhode Island's political establishment like an earthquake, sending shockwaves that would be felt for months and even years to come. Within hours of the proceedings, news outlets across the nation had picked up the story of the Deputy Attorney General who had committed perjury over a traffic ticket, and the gentle judge whose patient questioning had unraveled one of the most audacious attempts at judicial deception in recent memory. The immediate political consequences were swift and severe. Wellington's resignation from his position as Deputy Attorney General was formally accepted by the Attorney General within 3 hours of his courtroom confession. By evening, the governor had called a press conference to express his shock and disappointment at Wellington's conduct, emphasizing that such behavior was completely inconsistent with the values and standards expected of public officials in Rhode Island. The criminal referral that Judge Caprio had ordered moved through the system with unprecedented speed. The Rhode Island Attorney General's office, seeking to distance itself from the scandal and demonstrate its commitment to accountability, assigned a special prosecutor within 48 hours. Wellington was formally charged with perjury in the first degree, a felony carrying a potential sentence of up to 15 years in prison. The case also triggered a broader investigation into Wellington's conduct during his time in office. Questions arose about whether his willingness to lie under oath in such a brazen manner indicated a pattern of dishonesty that might have affected his prosecutorial decisions. Several defense attorneys whose clients had been prosecuted by Wellington announced their intention to review their cases for potential misconduct, and the state Supreme Court ordered an examination of all cases in which Wellington had been personally involved. Judge Caprio, meanwhile, handled the intense media attention with his characteristic grace and humility. When reporters asked him about the case, he emphasized that he had simply applied the law as he always did, treating Wellington no differently than any other defendant who appeared in his courtroom. He declined to comment on the political implications of the case, focusing instead on the importance of truth and accountability in the judicial system. The enhanced traffic camera footage that had been crucial in exposing Wellington's deception became the subject of significant discussion among law enforcement agencies. The successful use of forensic enhancement technology in what had begun as a routine traffic case led to increased investment in similar capabilities across Rhode Island and neighboring states. Police departments began reviewing their own traffic enforcement procedures, recognizing that even minor violations could sometimes reveal much larger patterns of dishonesty and criminality. Wellington's law license was suspended pending the outcome of his criminal case, effectively ending his legal career even before his trial began. The Character and Fitness Committee's investigation revealed a pattern of arrogance and entitlement dating back to his early career, including several instances where he had used his position to avoid accountability for minor infractions. While none of these previous incidents had been criminal in nature, they painted a picture of someone who had long believed himself to be above the rules that governed ordinary citizens. The financial consequences for Wellington were also severe. Legal fees for his criminal defense quickly exhausted his savings, and the loss of his government salary left him struggling to maintain the lifestyle he had enjoyed during his years in office. The expensive home he had purchased in Providence's historic Federal Hill neighborhood was quietly put up for sale, and he was forced to move to a modest apartment in a less prestigious part of the city. Perhaps most significantly, the case had a profound impact on public trust in government institutions. Polling conducted in the weeks following Wellington's confession showed a temporary decrease in confidence in state government, but also an increase in respect for the judicial system, and particularly for Judge Caprio. Citizens expressed appreciation that the judge had treated a powerful politician exactly as he would treat any other defendant, refusing to be influenced by political considerations or social pressure. The case also sparked broader conversations about political accountability and the culture of entitlement that sometimes developed among long-serving public officials. Editorial writers across New England used Wellington's downfall as an example of why regular ethical training and oversight were essential for maintaining public trust in government. Several states implemented new requirements for annual ethics training for high-ranking government officials, directly citing the Rhode Island case as a cautionary tale. 6 months after his confession, Wellington pleaded guilty to perjury charges in a plea agreement that resulted in a sentence of 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. The plea agreement also required him to pay restitution for the cost of the investigation and to permanently forfeit his law license. At his sentencing hearing, Wellington delivered what observers described as a genuinely remorseful statement, acknowledging the damage his actions had caused and expressing gratitude to Judge Caprio for forcing him to confront the truth about his character. Judge Caprio, who was invited to attend the sentencing hearing, chose not to speak during the proceedings, but was observed nodding approvingly when Wellington expressed genuine remorse for his actions. After the hearing, the judge briefly spoke with reporters, reiterating his belief that accountability and consequences could lead to genuine rehabilitation and personal growth. The broader legal community responded to the case with a mixture of shock and admiration. Law schools across the country began using the Wellington case as a teaching tool, illustrating both the importance of truthfulness in legal proceedings and the power of patient, methodical questioning to reveal deception. The case was cited in legal ethics courses as an example of how quickly professional careers could be destroyed by choices to prioritize personal interests over professional obligations. For Judge Caprio personally, the case represented both a professional triumph and a source of deep sadness. While he took satisfaction in the fact that justice had been served and truth had ultimately prevailed, he was genuinely saddened by the waste of human potential represented by Wellington's downfall. In private conversations with colleagues, he expressed hope that Wellington would use his time in prison to reflect on his choices and emerge as a better person, committed to making positive contributions to society. The courthouse where the dramatic proceedings had taken place became something of a pilgrimage site for law students and legal professionals interested in seeing where such a significant case had unfolded. Court staff reported increased requests for tours and information about Judge Caprio's methods and philosophy. The judge, characteristically humble, declined suggestions that a plaque be installed commemorating the case, arguing that the courtroom should remain focused on serving the people rather than celebrating particular moments. The traffic intersection where Wellington's original violation had occurred was quietly upgraded with additional safety features, including improved lighting and enhanced traffic signals. While this improvement was part of a broader city infrastructure project, local officials acknowledged that the high-profile case had drawn attention to the importance of traffic safety and the need for all citizens, regardless of their position, to follow traffic laws. Wellington's story served as a powerful reminder that in Judge Caprio's courtroom, and indeed in the American system of justice at its best, truth and integrity mattered more than power, position, or political connections. The gentle judge, who had built his reputation on compassion and second chances, had demonstrated that accountability and consequences were essential components of true justice. The case ultimately became a defining example of how the judicial system could function properly when guided by principles of fairness, patience, and unwavering commitment to truth. Judge Caprio's handling of the matter, firm but compassionate, thorough but respectful, illustrated why he had become such a beloved figure in American jurisprudence. Years later, when Wellington was released from prison and began the difficult process of rebuilding his life, he would often cite Judge Caprio's words about redemption and second chances as crucial to his personal transformation. Though he could never practice law again and would never hold public office, he found meaningful work with a non-profit organization helping other former inmates reintegrate into society. Finally, living up to the principles of service and accountability that he had once only claimed to embrace. The case of Marcus Wellington remained a powerful reminder that in Judge Caprio's courtroom, justice was not just about punishment. It was about truth, accountability, and the possibility that even those who had fallen furthest could find their way back to integrity and service. It stood as a testament to the enduring power of patience, wisdom, and gentle but unwavering commitment to the principles that made justice possible. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.